The number one ladies detective agency. Chapter 1. The Daddy. Mara Motswe had a detective agency in Africa at the foot of Gale Hill. These were its assets: a tiny white van, 2 desks, 2 chairs, a telephone, and an old typewriter. Then there was a teapot in which Mara Motswe, the only lady private detective in Botswana, brewed red bush tea, and 3 mugs, one for herself, one for her secretary, and one for the client. What else does a detective agency really need? Detective agencies rely on human intuition and intelligence, both of which Mara Motswe had in abundance. No inventory would ever include those, of course. But there was also the view, which again could appear on no inventory. How could any such list describe what one saw when one looked out from Mara Motswe's door? To the front, in a cassia tree, the thorn tree which dots the wide edges of the Kalahari, the great white thorns, a warning. The olive grey leaves, by contrast, so delicate. In its branches, in the late afternoon, or in the cool of the early morning, one might see a go-away bird, or hear it, rather. And beyond the cassia, over the dusty road, the roofs of the town under a cover of trees and scrub bush. On the horizon, in a blue shimmer of heat, the hills, like improbable, overgrown termite mounds. Everybody called her Mara Motswe, although if people had wanted to be formal, they would have addressed her as Madame Mara Motswe. This is the right thing for a person of stature, but which she had never used of herself. So it was always Mara Motswe, rather than Precious Ramotswe, a name which very few people employed. She was a good detective and a good woman. A good woman in a good country, one might say. She loved her country, Botswana, which is a place of peace, and she loved Africa for all its trials. "I'm not ashamed to be called an African patriot," said Mara Motswe. "I love all the people whom God made, but I especially know how to love the people who live in this place. They are my people, my brothers and sisters. It is my duty to help them to solve the mysteries in their lives. This is what I am called to do." In idle moments, when there were no pressing matters to be dealt with, and when everybody seemed to be sleepy from the heat, she would sit under a cassia tree. It was a dusty place to sit, and the chickens would occasionally come and peck about her feet, but it was a place which seemed to encourage thought. It was here that Mara Motswe would contemplate some of the issues which, in everyday life, may so easily be pushed to one side. Everything, thought Mara Motswe, had been something before. Here I am, the only lady private detective in the whole of Botswana, sitting in front of my detective agency. But only a few years ago there was no detective agency, and before that, before there were even any buildings here, there were just the acacia trees, and the riverbed in the distance, and the Kalahari over there, so close. In those days there was no Botswana even, just the Bichua, Naland Protectorate, and before that again there was Kama's country. The lines with the dry wind in their manes. But look at it now, a detective agency, right here in Gaborone, with me, the fat lady detective, sitting outside and thinking these thoughts about how what is one thing today becomes quite another thing tomorrow. Mara Motswe set up the number one ladies detective agency with the proceeds of the sale of her father's cattle. He had owned a big herd and had no other children, so every single beast, all 180 of them, including the white Brahmin bulls whose grandparents he had bred himself, went to her. The cattle were moved from the cattle post back to Mochudu, where they waited, in the dust, under the eyes of the chattering herd boys, until the livestock agent came. They fetched a good price, as there had been heavy rains that year, and the grass had been lush. Had it been the year before, when most of that southern part of Africa had been dragged by drought, it would have been a different matter. People had dithered then, wanting to hold on to their cattle, as without your cattle you were naked. Others, feeling more desperate, sold because the rains had failed year after year and they had seen the animals become thinner and thinner. Mara Motswe was pleased that her father's illness had prevented his making any decision, as now the price had gone up and those who had held on were well rewarded. I want you to have your own business, he said to her on his deathbed. You'll get a good price for the cattle now. Sell them and buy a business. A butchery, maybe. A bottle store. Whatever you like. She held her father's hand and looked into the eyes of the man she loved beyond all others. Her daddy. Her wise daddy, whose lungs had been filled with dust in those mines, who had scrimped and saved to make life good for her. It was difficult to talk through her tears, but she managed to say, I'm going to set up a detective agency down in Gaborone. It will be the best one in Botswana. The #1 agency. For a moment, her father's eyes opened wide and it seemed as if he was struggling to speak. But he died before he could say anything more, and Mara Motswe fell on his chest and wept for all the dignity, love and suffering that died with him. She had a sign painted in bright colors. It was then set up just off the Lobatse Road, on the edge of the town, pointing to the small building she had purchased. The #1 Ladies Detective Agency, for all confidential matters and inquiries. Satisfaction guaranteed for all parties. Under personal management. There was considerable public interest in the setting up of her agency. There was an interview on Radio Botswana in which she thought she was rather rudely pressed to reveal her qualifications, and a rather more satisfactory article in the Botswana News, which drew attention to the fact that she was the only lady private detective in the country. This article was cut out, copied, and placed prominently on a small board beside the front door of the agency.